It was a bright, sunny afternoon in one of the most popular tourist areas in London. Tourists from all over the world crowded the streets, their cameras ready to capture every moment. In the middle of the bustling crowd, a royal guard stood tall and proud. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, and his eyes focused straight ahead. He was used to the attention. Tourists often stopped to take pictures of the guards who stood guard at some of the most historic sites in the country. The guard was a black man, and while he looked calm and composed, his role came with a lot of responsibility. He wasn't just protecting the building. He was a symbol of history, duty, and pride. But that day, he would face something he had never expected. A tourist, who seemed to be in his mid-40s, walked up to the guard. His eyes narrowed in a strange way. He appeared to be a little tipsy, stumbling slightly as he moved. He was a big man, wearing a bright red shirt with a logo on it, and his face was flushed, either from the sun or too many drinks. He took a long look at the guard, then began muttering under his breath. At first, the guard thought nothing of it. He had been in this situation countless times before. People made jokes, took pictures, and sometimes even said things that weren't always nice. But then the words got louder. The tourist was talking about the guard's appearance, his uniform, his posture, and then his race. His words were filled with a tone that sounded off, like he was trying to get a rise out of the guard. The crowd around them didn't notice at first. Many were still busy snapping pictures, some even laughing at the strange man's loud voice. But then, the tourist stepped closer, walking right up to the guard. "You think you're special because you wear that?" he shouted. "What are you even doing here?" The guard's face remained stone cold, his eyes still looking straight ahead. He had been trained to remain still, to ignore distractions, and to not respond to any taunts. But this time, something about the tourist's words didn't sit right. His voice, sharp and full of hatred, filled the space between them. The guard took a deep breath. He was trained for situations like this. He knew that reacting could make things worse, so he stood still, ignoring the insults. His hands were behind his back, his posture unwavering, but inside, his heart was racing. The tourist wasn't done yet. He kept talking, getting louder, trying to provoke the guard. Some of the nearby tourists started to notice, their smiles turning into confused expressions. They began to murmur among themselves. The atmosphere around the guard changed from curiosity to something more uncomfortable. But the royal guard, still silent and calm, didn't move a muscle. He had a job to do. Little did he know, this would not be a normal day in the life of a royal guard. Something far worse was about to happen, and the consequences would be felt by more people than just him. The tourist's voice grew louder as he continued to insult the royal guard. More people around them began to notice, and the crowd started to shift. Some of the tourists looked uncomfortable, unsure of what was happening. But there was one thing everyone could see. The guard, still standing tall, was doing his job. His face didn't show any emotion, and his body remained still. He wasn't going to engage, no matter what the tourists said. But the man, who had clearly been drinking, wasn't finished. His insults grew worse, and now his words were filled with anger. He stepped closer to the guard, his face red with frustration. The guard didn't move an inch, but the tension in the air was growing thicker. Without warning, the tourist suddenly reached out and shoved the guard. It wasn't a strong push, but it was enough to break the silence that had been surrounding them. People gasped, and a few onlookers shouted in surprise. The royal guard was attacked, right in the middle of a busy street, by a tourist who clearly had no respect for the officer or his role. The guard's first instinct was to fight back, but he quickly remembered his training. He couldn't react violently. He was a symbol of peace and order, and he had to keep control of himself. Instead of retaliating, he simply moved slightly, using his arm to push the tourist's hand away. His face remained calm and neutral, but his body was tense, ready for whatever might come next. The crowd around them was starting to form a circle. Some people tried to get closer, while others backed away, worried about what might happen. A few started recording the scene on their phones. It was clear that things were escalating quickly. The tourist, now even angrier, started shouting more insults, but this time his words were laced with hatred. He called the guard names and accused him of being in a job that didn't belong to him. For a moment, it seemed like the situation could get out of control. The guard was standing his ground, but the tourist was becoming more violent with every passing second. Just as the tourist took another step forward, ready to push the guard again, other officers appeared, rushing to the scene. The Royal Guard had called for backup earlier, and now the other officers quickly arrived, their uniforms visible in the distance. The crowd parted as the officers made their way to the tourist. They immediately grabbed him, pulling him away from the guard and restraining him. "Sir, you need to calm down," one of the officers shouted as they placed the tourist in handcuffs. But the man continued to resist, shouting at the top of his lungs, refusing to back down. "I didn't do anything wrong," he yelled. "This is all his fault." The officers, who were trained to handle situations like this, quickly controlled the man. They didn't give him any more chances to escalate the situation. The Royal Guard, although shaken by the attack, remained composed. His professionalism had helped keep things from getting worse. The crowd, now quiet, watched as the tourist was led away. The air was heavy with tension, but there was also a feeling of relief that the situation was finally under control. People whispered to each other about what had just happened, many of them still in disbelief that something like this could happen in such a public place. The Royal Guard stood tall once again, though his hands were slightly trembling. He had faced the challenge without reacting, but the stress of the moment had taken its toll. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the event settle on his shoulders. But little did he know, the real consequences of the attack were only just beginning. As the officers led the tourist away, the Royal Guard stood silently, still processing what had just happened. His uniform was neat, and his stance remained as firm as ever, but inside, his mind was racing. He had been attacked by a stranger, something he had never experienced before in his years of service. Though his training had kept him calm, the shock of the situation lingered. Around him, the crowd was slowly dispersing, but many people still stayed, whispering about the altercation they had just witnessed. Some were concerned for the guard, while others were more interested in the drama of the event. A few tourists began to approach the guard, offering apologies or words of support. One woman, a middle-aged tourist from Germany, walked up to the Royal Guard and said softly, "I'm so sorry for what just happened." That man was completely out of line. The guard nodded slightly, acknowledging her kindness, but his face remained serious. He was used to being in the spotlight, but this was different. He had never had to deal with such an intense and personal attack before. "I'm just doing my job," the guard replied quietly, his voice steady, but a bit weary. The woman smiled sympathetically, but she didn't press the matter further. She left, and soon the area became less crowded. The guard had a chance to breathe, but the reality of the situation still hung over him. His colleagues, who had arrived just in time to stop the tourist from causing any further trouble, approached him. "You okay?" one of the officers asked, looking him over carefully. The guard gave a small nod. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice didn't carry the same strength it usually did. His nerves were still on edge from the confrontation. "I just wasn't expecting that." "Don't worry about it. We've got your back," another officer reassured him. "Let's get you off duty for the rest of the day. You've been through enough." The guard wasn't sure if he wanted to leave yet. He had a duty to remain in place, to protect the area he was assigned to. But he also understood that it was probably for the best to take a break and let the situation cool down. He agreed with a nod, stepping away from the post and walking with the officers toward the nearby guard station. As they walked, the crowd began to thin out, and the buzz of excitement from the incident started to fade. Tourists returned to taking pictures of the historic sites, not fully realizing the tension that had just unfolded in front of them. For most people, it was just another story to tell later. But for the Royal Guard, it was an experience he wouldn't forget. Meanwhile, the tourist, who had been handcuffed and led to a nearby police car, was becoming more frantic. He yelled and struggled, demanding to be let go. He couldn't understand why he was being arrested. He had only spoken his mind, in his opinion. But the officers weren't listening to his complaints. They had their own duties to attend to, and one of those duties was making sure he was held accountable for his actions. As the car doors slammed shut, the tourist was taken away. But the story was far from over. Back at the station, things would get even more complicated for him. As the Royal Guard made his way back to the station with his colleagues, the atmosphere was tense. He didn't speak much, lost in his thoughts. His mind kept replaying the moments of the attack, the anger in the tourist's voice, the feeling of being pushed. Though he had handled the situation with composure, the guard couldn't shake the weight of it all. When they arrived at the station, the other officers offered their support, but the guard declined their offer to sit down. He preferred to stay standing, as it helped him feel more in control. He didn't want to let his guard down just yet. Meanwhile, outside the station, the news of the incident was already starting to spread. Tourists who had witnessed the event began sharing the details with others, and the story soon made its way to social media. Videos of the incident began popping up online. People had captured the moment the tourist shoved the guard and shouted insults. The videos quickly went viral. Back at the police station, the tourist was still in a state of shock. He couldn't believe he had been arrested. His face was flushed with anger, and he was still shouting at the officers, demanding that they release him. But the police were firm in their actions. They had seen his aggressive behavior, and they knew he had crossed a line. The tourist was not only facing charges for assault and public disturbance, but now, with the videos going viral, there was a new layer of public attention. His actions were being criticized everywhere. The hashtag #RespectTheGuard began trending online, and many people were expressing their anger at how the tourist had treated the Royal Guard. While the tourist was yelling at the officers, he started to realize the full extent of what he had done. He wasn't just in trouble with the law. He was also facing the judgment of the entire public. His face appeared in news articles and social media posts, and people from all over the world were commenting on the incident. Some people expressed outrage at his behavior, while others wondered why he had acted that way in the first place. In the station, the police were preparing the tourist for his formal charges. They had gathered all the evidence they needed, including the videos, witness statements, and the Royal Guard's testimony. The man's actions had clearly broken the law, and the police were determined to make sure he was held accountable. As the tourist was being processed for jail, the Royal Guard was still on his break, away from the public eye. He had no idea how much the situation had escalated in such a short amount of time. His role in the incident had turned into a headline across the world. But for him, the most important thing was that he had done his job with dignity. He had stayed calm, and he had prevented the situation from becoming even worse. Later that afternoon, the guard returned to his post, but everything had changed. The people walking by him now looked at him with admiration. The incident had turned him into a symbol of strength and professionalism. He had proven that no matter the challenge, he would stand his ground. The next morning, news of the incident continued to spread. Headlines everywhere were talking about the Royal Guard and the tourist who had attacked him. Some people were shocked that such a thing had happened at such a famous and respected location, while others were expressing their anger toward the tourist's behavior. Videos of the attack had gone viral, and many people were commenting on how calmly the Royal Guard had handled the situation. Back at the police station, the tourist was still locked up in a cell. His mood had shifted from angry to frustrated, and now it was turning into regret. He had spent the night in jail, and the reality of his actions was beginning to set in. He had been arrested for assault, disturbing the peace, and for making threats. The tourist had never thought he would end up in this position. It had all started with a few words, and now it had become something much bigger. As the hours passed, the tourist's attitude began to change. At first, he had refused to admit he had done anything wrong. But now, as he sat alone in the cell, he couldn't deny the seriousness of the situation. He had insulted a man who was just doing his job. And worse, he had physically attacked him. The reality was hard to swallow. His mind raced as he thought about the consequences. He knew he would have to face the judge, and the thought of being in front of a courtroom made him nervous. Meanwhile, outside the station, more people were talking about the incident. Tourists who had been visiting the area the day before now knew about the attack. Many had seen the viral videos and started discussing what had happened. Some expressed anger at the tourists' behavior, while others praised the Royal Guard for staying calm under such difficult circumstances. The Royal Guard had become a symbol of professionalism and strength. He had done his job without reacting to the insults or the physical attack. His ability to remain calm and collected in the face of such aggression was being praised by many. People from all over the world were commenting on how impressed they were with his composure. For the Royal Guard, however, the attention didn't matter. He had always known that his job came with challenges. He had learned long ago not to let distractions or hostility affect him. He wasn't in it for the praise or recognition. He was there to protect and serve. But that didn't mean the incident had not left an impact on him. It was impossible to forget being pushed, being insulted in front of so many people. He knew it was part of his job, but that didn't make it any easier. Back at the police station, the tourist finally agreed to speak with an officer. The officer asked him about the events of the previous day, and at first, the tourist was defensive. He tried to explain that he was just frustrated, that he didn't mean to cause trouble. But as the officer calmly went over the details, the tourist's tone began to soften. He realized that no matter how upset he had been, he had crossed a line. His actions had consequences, and now he was going to have to deal with them. That afternoon, the tourist was formally charged with assault and disturbing the peace. He would have to go to court and face the consequences of his actions. But even as the process moved forward, the tourist couldn't stop thinking about the guard. He had been wrong, and he knew it. The Royal Guard sat quietly in his small break room at the station. Though the bustle of the city continued outside, inside, everything felt still. He had been through many events during his career, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about protecting the area. It was about being personally attacked. The memories of the tourist's insults and the sudden push still echoed in his mind, but he didn't show it. He had learned long ago to keep his emotions under control. Still, that day had been a reminder of the harsh reality that sometimes people don't respect the people who serve them. His fellow officers had checked on him throughout the day, offering words of encouragement. They knew he was a strong man, both physically and mentally, but even the strongest of people need support. The guard appreciated their concern, but wanted to move forward. The attention the incident had attracted was overwhelming, and it wasn't something he enjoyed. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted to do his job without interruptions. But as the day went on, it became clear that the incident had made an impact far beyond the walls of the station. News outlets had picked up the story, and the viral videos from the previous day were shared over and over again. People from around the world commented on the Royal Guard's calm demeanor, praising him for handling the situation with grace and professionalism. To many, he had become a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity. Despite the praise, the guard felt conflicted. He wasn't in it for recognition. He never had been. His role had always been about duty, being part of something larger than himself, representing a long history of tradition and service. It was his job to remain calm and composed, and he had done that. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the incident had left a mark on him. The attack had been a reminder that not everyone sees the value in what he does, and not everyone respects the people who protect them. Later that afternoon, the guard was called to speak with his superior, who thanked him for his professionalism. "You handled that situation better than most would have, especially under such pressure," the officer said. "We're proud of you." The words meant a lot, but the guard just nodded in acknowledgement. He wasn't seeking praise. He was just doing his job. As the evening approached, the guard found himself walking through the city streets again, back to his post. He passed by the same crowds of tourists, many of them still unaware of what had happened the day before. A few people recognized him from the news, giving him a respectful nod or a friendly smile. He didn't respond, his face still serious, as he focused on the task at hand. At his post, everything seemed normal again. The tourists were taking pictures, asking questions, and admiring the historical buildings. The guard remained standing, his eyes focused straight ahead, but now, a sense of pride filled him. He wasn't just standing there as a figure in a uniform. He was standing there as a reminder that no matter what happens, no matter how people treat you, your job, your duty, and your dignity remain important. He had stood his ground in the face of aggression, and he had done so with strength. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the historic building, the Royal Guard knew that the day's events had changed him in a way. He would always remember the tourists' insults, the shove, and the chaos. But he would also remember how he kept his composure, how he stayed true to his duty. And that, he realized, was the true reward. The next morning, the tourist sat in a small gray interrogation room at the police station. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and his face was tired, a mixture of frustration and regret written all over it. He had spent the night in a cold, uncomfortable cell, and now, as the morning light filtered through the window, he was starting to understand the gravity of what he had done. At first, he had refused to admit any wrongdoing. He had thought the guard was just overreacting. After all, it was just a few words, right? But now, sitting alone in the room, he realized how wrong he had been. He had insulted someone who was just doing his job, and worse, he had physically attacked the man. The guilt was beginning to sink in. The door to the room opened, and a police officer entered. The officer was calm and professional, but the tourist could see the disappointment in his eyes. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday," the officer said, sitting down across from the tourist. The tourist didn't speak at first. He stared at his hands, still cuffed in front of him. The reality of the situation was hitting him harder than he had expected. I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said, his voice quieter than it had been the day before. The officer nodded. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You physically attacked a royal guard, someone who was simply doing his job. And then you insulted him based on his race. That's a serious matter." The tourist swallowed hard. He had heard the officer's words, but they felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He had always considered himself a good person. He wasn't someone who meant harm. But now, all of that felt like a distant memory. His actions had consequences, and he was about to face them. "I was drunk," the tourist said, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't know what came over me. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The officer gave him a stern look. "Alcohol isn't an excuse. You crossed a line, and now you'll have to face the consequences." The tourist's mind raced as the officer continued explaining the charges: assault, public disturbance, and making racist comments. The officer went on to explain that there were videos of the incident, and they had already been shared widely online. The tourist's actions were no longer something that could be swept under the rug. People had seen it, and now the whole world was judging him. "I know I messed up," the tourist finally said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what I was thinking. I'm sorry for what I did." "I'm sorry" to him, to the guard. The officer looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself in court. But remember, the guard didn't deserve what happened to him." As the conversation ended, the tourist was led back to his cell. The words of the officer echoed in his mind. "You'll have to face the consequences." He didn't know how he would move forward from here, but one thing was clear: he had learned a hard lesson. Back in the outside world, The royal guard's name was still being praised. He had become a symbol of dignity and strength, while the tourist's name became a symbol of shame. The tourist would face a long road ahead, filled with legal consequences and the weight of his actions. And though he may never forget the moment he attacked the guard, he would never forget the lessons that came with it. A few weeks had passed since the tourist was arrested for attacking the royal guard. The incident was still fresh in the minds of many, and now it was time for the tourist to face the consequences in court. The courtroom was filled with people, some of whom had followed the case closely in the news. The royal guard had been called to testify, and many others, including witnesses from the crowd that day, were present. The tourist, now sitting nervously in the defendant's chair, looked around the courtroom. He had never imagined he would be in a place like this. The reality of his situation was sinking in. He had been in trouble before, but this time it felt different. He wasn't just facing legal consequences, he was facing the judgment of the public. The royal guard sat in the witness stand, looking calm and composed as always. He was still in his uniform, a symbol of duty and professionalism. The moment he took the stand, all eyes were on him. The judge asked him to recount what had happened that day. The royal guard did not hesitate. He explained, in a clear and steady voice, how the tourist had approached him with insults and how the situation escalated to a physical confrontation. As a royal guard, I am trained to remain calm and neutral in difficult situations, the guard explained. I did not respond to his insults, but when he pushed me, I knew I had to call for backup. The royal guard's testimony was straightforward, but it carried weight. It was clear that he had acted professionally and had not let the attack affect his duty. Many people in the courtroom, especially those who had followed the news, were impressed by his composure. He had remained calm in the face of aggression, and it showed in his words. The tourist, on the other hand, looked down at the table as he listened to the guard's testimony. He felt a deep sense of shame. He had never meant to cause harm, but now, hearing the royal guard speak so calmly about the events, he realized how wrong he had been. The tourist had allowed his anger and alcohol to cloud his judgment, and now he had to pay the price. When it was his turn to speak, the tourist took a deep breath before standing up. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew he had to apologize. I want to say I'm sorry to the guard, to everyone who was affected by my actions, he said, his voice shaking. I wasn't thinking clearly that day. I shouldn't have attacked him. He didn't deserve that. The judge listened carefully, nodding as the tourist spoke. The court was silent, and everyone seemed to be waiting for the next words to be spoken. The tourist's apology seemed sincere, but the damage had already been done. After hearing from both the royal guard and the tourist, the judge announced that the tourist would be sentenced to community service and a fine. His actions had been serious, but he had shown remorse. The sentence wasn't as harsh as it could have been, but it was clear that the tourist had learned a valuable lesson. As the court session ended, the royal guard stood up and left the room. He didn't need the attention or the praise. He had done his job, and that was enough for him. The tourist, though, would leave with more than just a fine and community service. He would leave with a lesson about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of his actions. The incident had changed both of their lives, but for different reasons. For the royal guard, it had reaffirmed his commitment to his duty. For the tourist, it had been a wake-up call that would follow him for a long time. Several months passed after the court case. The tourist's life had been changed by the incident, and the royal guard had returned to his usual duties, but things were different.